Welcome everyone to this session, this track on channeling resources for resilience. My name is Alfred Ho. I'm a professor at City University of Hong Kong. You may find it surprising that Dr. Alex Lam is not sitting here. It's because of some personal health reason he could not join us today. And so I'm going to help him to facilitate this particular track. Today we are going to talk a little bit about in this changing global economy, we need to have more sustainable development solutions, and it's very crucial to have some joint sectoral actions to preserve our planet's natural environment and resources for the future generations. And the recent pandemic and escalation of environmental issues has severe impacts on global economy and its resources. And in these challenging times, public and private sectors have accelerated the important work of advancing innovative ways to solve some of the complex environmental issues. And so I know that Dr. Alex Lam and many people have put a lot of thought to organize this section. And so in this particular session, we will explore case studies from public and private sectors that promote ESG and innovative finance to improve societal resilience and to build a more sustainable future for all. And so what we will do is that we are going to have several presentations first and then have some discussion and then Q&A. Today, we are very fortunate to have several speakers, both locally and also remotely. Mr. Zhang Chanyao is here. He is from Carbon Care InnoLab in Hong Kong. We also have two speakers from overseas, Maggie Low from Bridge Fund Management in the UK, as well as Jonathan Wong from UNESCO, Chief of Innovation, Technology and Innovation for Asia and Pacific. And so we have basically a cross-sectoral collaboration in this panel, and I hope that you will enjoy this. Without further ado, I'm going to actually show you some of the background information. And so could you all see the slides prepared by Dr. Alex Lam? And so again, the context for our panel is that indeed SDG is very, very important. We know that there are a lot of challenges in the world here because of poverty issues, because of health issues. We know that there are 93 million more people into extreme poverty in 2020. Especially the pandemic has actually really hurt the economy. More people are suffering. We also know that there are more climate risk, near 14% increase by 2030 if we don't have a more proactive action. And so indeed, we need more cross-sectoral and also innovative solutions. Next slide, please. Maybe I should control, sorry. Yep. And so you could see here that we do have some plan, right? Going to this plan, SDGs development in Asia and Pacific, achieving our long-term goals, right? So we are in 2022 now. If you look forward to about 30 years from now, hopefully we are all still here. You notice that we are only way above 4%. We are achieving in 2017, so we still have a long way to go. If you actually look beyond that to 2057, 35 years from now, we're only not there yet, right? And so even by now, we are still only achieving about 12% of the 2065 goal. And so you notice that we have a long way to go. And so today we're going to actually look at the cross-sectoral partnership to achieve the 4 Ps, right? The people-oriented economy, the planet, environmental friendly environment, also prosperity for all and an inclusive economy, and more important, and most importantly today in this global order, how to have more peaceful development for all. And so these are some of the long-term goals. And let me also give you a little bit more background on this. Could you go to the next set of slides? Yep. And so, so you could see that we have all those goals just now, right? And to achieve that, we do need some financial support. Now, this is actually from a recent report by OECD looking at the funding gap. Recently, there's a major agreement among the developed countries saying that we will invest more. But even with that, we still see a big gap to achieve the SDG goal. Right? So there's a UN target, and we are not achieving some of the promised goals. And so there's a long way to go how we could do more. And so clearly relying just simply on governmental funding and international assistance alone will not be sufficient for us. At the same time, we see a lot of need. This is from another report by the IMF, and you see that actually there are a lot more natural resources recorded and reported over time. And because of climate change issues, we know that there will be actually a lot more resilience concerns, especially among developing economies in the Pacific, by the ocean, etc. And so there are a lot more needs that we need to deal with. You see that within these continents, there's especially big need among the African countries, but even within East Asia and Pacific, many of us talk about smart city, all kinds of higher living quality. We need more electricity. And so you notice that according to the IMF, we need a lot more capital investment in electricity, in energy sector. And so altogether in Asian and Pacific region, we still have about 4% need in the GDP to really invest in some of these capital investment. And this is just about infrastructure and capital investment, right? There are a lot more than that. And so in this panel, we're going to explore some cross-sectoral partnerships. Now, this is actually a general theoretical framework. When we talk about PPP, a lot of people talk about public-private partnership. There are many forms and strategies. And so governmental actions usually is about spending, right? Business, we are talking about ESG and also impact investment within the nonprofit foundations. They have a lot of actions working with individual citizens. But altogether, what we try to focus on is not the individual circle, but the cross. Look at this Venn diagram. It's the overlapping area. How government could work with businesses, how business could work with nonprofit or individual citizens themselves actually may have some responsibility. And so we are talking about some maybe special financial instruments, maybe some incentives, and all kinds of partnership mechanisms that we try to talk about. And indeed, today we are going to look at some of the innovative approach to do it. And so very quickly, let me just show some examples. I know in other countries, for example, in the US, Kansas City actually used this kind of public-private partnership to actually improve the smart city. And the reason why it worked is because the private sector sees some potential because they could leverage it to pilot, test some technologies, and also they get the data. Whereas the public sector said we get free access to some infrastructure needs. And so there's one example to achieve SDG in Kansas City, Missouri. This is something quite new. In the US now, they are talking about the EPA is pushing what they call community-based PPP to support some infrastructure. For those who are familiar with the financing mechanism in the US, for a long time, people talk about tax increment financing, TIPS, right? TIPS bonds. But now this is actually a new innovation because this is actually a lot more community-driven, more participatory driven in the mechanism. So this is something new, and I think there are a lot of potential for us to think about in Hong Kong. And so there are other mechanisms like social impact bonds. I think this kind of instrument are not foreign to many of you in this conference. And so I will let also other speakers to talk about those more. And so this is also very interesting. This is very recent related to the pandemic. You look at here, this is truly a cross-sectoral partnership with New York City, the mayor's office, working with Zoom, which is a private business, and we all use Zoom a lot, right? And then we've also Rockefeller Foundation, which is an NGO foundation, and then also a scholarship foundation, nonprofit called Education Superhighway to offer Wi-Fi broadband access to students during this pandemic in New York City. So we see these kind of examples from different parts of the world to see how public-private partnership could be leveraged to deliver some outcomes and impacts. And finally, let me just conclude before we go into some specific examples from different areas. The reason why we think this is important is because if you actually look at the solid line, right, we all talk about impact and values, right? If you have more benefits than cost, that's where you see value. Well, the key thing or the hypothesis or the advocation we have is that if we actually leverage PPP, we could scale up the benefits and scale up and also lower the cost, right? Because by by involving more partners, we could actually potentially expand, scale up, having more impact in different communities. At the same time, we could leverage the resources and the competencies in other sectors, not just in the private sector alone or in the public sector alone. So this is why we think PPP may be a very important way to think about the scale up. And so with that, I'm going to actually turn to our first presenter, who actually will share a little bit about the experiences in Hong Kong, how we actually try to use public-private partnership to do something very innovative. And so I'm going to turn the floor to Mr. Zhong Chenyao.
Thank you. Hello. Okay. Hello. Okay. Is the mic working? Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Alfred, to take up the additional role of mic holder for me, because I need to read some of my notes with my fingers. And also thank you, Alex, for inviting me. Unfortunately, he is unable to be in the venue, but he assured me that he is listening, so asked me to be careful. Okay, so and he's a very good person, very concerned about international development. So I hope we will meet up to his expectation in the sharing going forward. I have founded an organization called Carbon Care InnoLab about 7 or 8 years ago with like-minded people. And CCIL is about climate justice, carbon reduction, resource conservation, and adaptation and resilience building. So we have a program to introduce to you solar care program that demonstrates how public and private partnership can go hand in hand. But let's go back to the problem first. The problem is in 2015, the Paris Agreement sets out a target that at the end of the century, we should aim at keeping temperature 1.5 degree higher than industrial pre-industrial revolution level. And so what have we, to achieve that, by 2050, we need to achieve carbon neutrality. And an earlier milestone is by 2030, we need to halve carbon reduction compared to 2010. Okay, so but what have we done so far? In Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, only 30 countries have renewed their carbon reduction target compared to last year. And the rest keep on their old target. And it ended up that we will see a world of 2.8 degrees or 2.4, depends on different estimation. And this is still well above the 1.5 degree level. So what would happen? It will mean sea level rise. If 2 degrees, it will mean 46 million people will be affected. And if it ends up to be a 4-degree world, then we will see huge increase in sea level, and 400 million people will be affected, 400 million. So that's a large number. And we are not even sure that the world can exist as it is right now for humanity. So it is an existential threat, but we are not listening. For Hong Kong, We set out a target of carbon neutrality by 2050. That's good. And we said we increase the renewable energy level to 7% by 2035. But that's not going to be enough. And we keep on listening to the government, hearing the government saying we don't have a lot of renewable energy in this city, and we don't believe it. So that's why Carbon Care InnoLab want to introduce a program to actually demonstrate how we can make use of the community resources. So leveraging on the feed-in tariff scheme introduced by the government in 2018, where community-generated, privately generated carbon solar systems electricity can be sold back to the electricity power companies with a huge, substantial tariff. So how we leverage the community resources. So we have a scheme called Solar Care InnoLab. And this is funded by the Jockey Club. With capital investment, we can demonstrate solar PV systems as a community resources, not just as a private. And this serves also to generate long-term financial resources for NGO as well as for climate education programs. And it will also enable us to reach different stakeholders to promote carbon reduction and climate change. So, so far we have already built 22 systems since the program starts in 2019, even through difficult time of COVID-19. So altogether they generate 1.6 or 1,600 MWH. That means in Cantonese 160萬度. And that means we can generate 6 million Hong Kong dollars a year for the participating NGO and us, CCIL. And if the total project ends by 2024, we will look to build 70 systems with 70 NGOs. And then altogether, they would generate 4,800 MPH. That means we will be able to support the electricity usage of 1,000 families a year. And then all these figures about 3,000 tons of carbon emissions. But this is just 1 year. So going on, it will last for another 10 years. So the whole system will be able to generate $16 million a year for 10 years. So it will be 160 million Hong Kong dollars for NGOs and for us. And this scheme is funded by the Jockey Club. We convince them of turning a capital investment into a recurrent investment. And it will enable us to reach a lot of different, almost unexpected sectors in the community. I'll quickly give you a few examples. For example, we work with Pressure Blood Children's Village, which is a protection center for teenagers and children. And the sister said that our program enabled them to save a lot of electricity money, and at the same time, we'll be able to give their girls an opportunity to be concerned about what happened in the rest of the world. We also work with Crossroad, which is an international organization about international development. And they told us that our support enabled them to give protection to Hong Kong people, as well as to support people in wars and conflicts around the world. So, and then we have a program with the a Silver Mine Bay camp. A lot of us have been there when we were school children. So I want to show you a clip of a singer, a popular singer, Kay, who support us in promoting the scheme. Okay, can you play the video? Okay. 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 There is a technical problem. There is no sound, right? But it doesn't matter. So in the interest of time, I'll play you the whole video if you come to me later. And
or you can sing, but.
Okay. Okay. 謝安琪幫我哋手 promote 嚇。Another one, we also built the system in an island called Yim Tien Zai, which is known to Hong Kong as a classical island with a lot of heritage. It's a Catholic island of Hakka village. Okay, so and we organized a festival there this summer, and another young people's idol also spoke for the system. Also, and can you try this one? Another video clip. 都係冇聲係咪啊 ？Okay, it doesn't matter. Again, we can. These things are all on our website, so you can come and look at it if you are interested. So the whole we will still be welcoming new NGOs to join our schemes. So it's about engaging all different sectors. Climate change is concerned about everybody. Therefore, from young to old, from business to NGO and government, we should all act together. And some organizations who have a religious principle not to accept Jockey Club's money, we managed to get Hang Seng Bank to support, for example, the Breakthrough Village to build the same system. So it's a scheme that we can engage business and a lot of different stakeholders together. We need to invest in the young. That's why one of our education program is called KT, training young advocates on climate change. And we send some of them, 8 of them, to COP27. That's the largest young people group representing Hong Kong. And they spoke, they contribute, they bring back a lot of information. And we have also a briefing last evening. Again, it will be on our websites and Facebook. So follow our websites and Facebook. To conclude, this is one example where we can get together different sectors, turning capital into a recurring income, generating, using renewable energy to generate support. And we believe that the whole community have a lot of space for renewable energy. Sorry for taking longer than I was assigned the time, and I hope you will find this presentation useful and look forward to the sharing later.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. So let's give him a round of applause. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but let's save all the questions till later. So we actually have another presenter, Ms. Maggie Low from Bridge Fund Management. Is she available online?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so I will hand the floor to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Maggie Liu. I am joining you from London and hoping to tell you a little bit about the firm that I work for called Bridges Fund Management. I hope you can see the slides that are being shown. So we have been very focused on backing solutions that support a transition to a more sustainable and inclusive economy. For us, we think about the kind of two main challenges of our generation, the climate crisis, but also deeply linked to that, the escalating inequality that we're seeing across the world in the developed as well as developing economies. And we believe that private capital has a very important role to play to help build a better future for people and planet. And it's also a great way for us to also find attractive investment opportunities. So I just wanted to take the next 5 to 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about our activities across our platform. As you can see here, a little bit more about Bridges. So we particularly focus in the private markets. So we're thinking about how private capital can be used to support businesses in as well as real estate developments, as well as social outcomes contracts. So that's something that I'm going to touch on in turn. Based in London, we have presence in the US, and we also have some affiliates in Israel and Australia. We primarily invest in UK, Europe, and US, but as I'll come on to talking to you about, we've recently launched an activity that is investing in emerging markets as well. As a firm, because we got started in the whole sustainable and impact investment space over 20 years ago, we always knew that we needed to really build a market to enable more capital to be flowing into these areas. And so we have been a global thought leader in thinking about how impacts can be measured and then importantly managed. And more recently, folks might be aware of the Impact Management Project, which our firm facilitated through our advisory activities to help create some consensus about how you think about impact. Overall, so alongside this advisory business, our main activities is about managing funds that we raise from a range of institutional and private investors. So overall, we've raised about 1.4 billion sterling and made over now probably over 200 investments across 3 main areas. And overall, we are, thinking about how you can help channel more and more capital to meet these challenges of climate and inequalities. The way we think about those challenges, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals have been quite an important construct. So out of the 17 SDGs, we have really focused on 6 in this case, because we think about, the sustainable and inclusive economy in terms of 4 main themes. So clearly there's a sustainable planet, but then very deeply interlinked are issues around how you achieve better outcomes for people in terms of healthier lives, building stronger communities, and also equipping them with future skills. So these 4 key themes are central to our platform, and also because they're central to this transition that we care so much about. How we then look to deploy capitals really comes into 3 main verticals that I mentioned earlier: backing businesses in our growth business activities, so primarily through private equity, We have real estate activities, and then finally outcomes contracts, also known as social impact bond, that Alfred mentioned earlier. So the rest of my remarks now will go through and give you some examples of the first two, and then the last bit of my segment, I'll go into a little bit more detail about how the social outcomes contracts construct has been kind of delivering really good results for us in the UK context, and it's something that we're now bringing to be a more global activity as well. So firstly, in terms of the growth business side, I have here showing you a case study of one of our recent investment and also realization. This is in the key sector of, for us, sustainable planet. And one of the ways that we think we can achieve a more sustainable planet is through championing more circular economy business models. So by circular economy, we're talking about enabling more products to be reused rather than being, just thrown away into landfill. We have the opportunity to back this business called World of Books. They are a pioneer in the reuse and recycling, really resale of used books that might otherwise have gone to landfill. So they're a leading circular economy technology business. At the basic level, what they're doing is they're buying books either from the charity sector in the UK, of which we have lots of charity shops where they take donations from households, including books, some of which they're not able to resell. And so before this business came along, many of those books were just simply thrown away. The business also sources directly from consumers through an app. So again, this is the kind of innovation bit coming in that has enabled them to collect books directly from consumers. So books that might be sitting in your bookshelves in your homes that you've already read it, but you kind of just sitting there. And so you have the opportunity to scan them, and then the company will determine whether they can buy the book from you. Once they collect the books, they have an algorithm to very quickly determine whether the book has a resale value or not. If they do, then they resell it on a number of e-commerce platforms. Otherwise, they send the books to a paper recycling plant. So they sell over 2 million used books annually to basically all the countries in the world. We've now we own the business for about 4.5 years. And over the course of our ownership, it has diverted over 125,000 tons of used books away from landfill. And then, a lot of that activity means that they're also averting net zero carbon emissions. So more than 23,000 tons of net carbon emissions averted as well. And then finally, crucially, because of that business model of working with charities, they've also contributed more than 5 million pounds of income to the charities. So it's also a business that we were able to generate pretty healthy returns to our investors. So we, for every pound that we invested in the business, we returned £6. So over 6 times money multiple for our investors. Then just touching on our real estate activities, we are very much interested in how you can regenerate certain areas, and also the opportunities to drive the carbon agenda and the transition to a net zero future through the built environment. We know that in the UK, 40% of our carbon emissions are related to buildings, and many of our building stock is very old. So we are really focused on both building new buildings to a very high green standard, but also refurbishing existing buildings. What I'm showing you here is one of our lower cost housing projects. This is located in a southern, kind of south of London, a place called Croydon, where we worked with the local council to turn a former town hall location into over 500 units of high quality and sustainable units of housing. And of those 513 units, over half of them were units that were reserved for social or more affordable housing. So in this way, we've been able to also solve the housing shortage that we face in particularly acute in London and across the UK. And then in terms of the development itself, it's actually, we just finished building this, and we were able to, through the design, achieve a 50% emission reduction over a standard new build development. And in achieving that, we were incorporating things like a combined heat and power unit, and then also over almost 4,000 square feet of solar PV has been installed. And so overall, we've been able to hit both the need for more housing, but also look to implement and build a very sustainable building. So I just wanted to come back to this now, and then now spend the rest of my remarks, hopefully the next 3 to 5 minutes, on the outcomes contracts work. This is a really quite an innovative way for that public-private partnership that Alfred talked about has really come to life in our experience. I think the backdrop to this is something we've already touched on, that the demand on public services globally is increasing. And unfortunately, outcomes are not actually getting delivered to improve the lives of people or planet. And so our activity in this space, Bridges Outcomes Partnerships, really exists to tackle this challenge. You know, we're probably familiar with a lot of challenges. These are really being manifested across many different economies. So in the UK, we have over 80,000 children that are often separated from their families and need to be looked after by the government, by the state, often leading to not very good outcomes for them. We have also increasing homelessness as escalating inequality happens. And I think the recent rising inflation will unfortunately, you know, drive more of this to occur. We have a huge need with an aging population for carers for vulnerable people to be looked after by unpaid carers. We also have, you know, in many economies, still lots of women dying from preventable causes related to childbirth and pregnancy. So what can we do about this? We think that there is a really good opportunity for an outcomes-based partnership to contribute to this challenge. So what does that mean? The way that we think about it is that you have essentially two main bodies that are involved in this. You have a funder, which could be a government body, a donor, a foundation, or indeed actually increasingly we're saying it could be a corporation, who are willing to pay for the outcome, so social or environmental, to be achieved, rather than paying for the delivery of a specific service. So that's quite a difference from the way that often how the current system is run. Then you have the delivery partnership, who has therefore the freedom to innovate and then also to, you know, try out new approaches in order to deliver these shared outcomes. So essentially an outcomes-based partnership or social impact bond, which was another name that you could think of, is essentially any contract where an organization is paying for outcomes. Now, to illustrate this further, let's think about how the model differs from between a payer paying for the delivery of a specific service and a payer paying for outcomes. So in the former example, the donor is defining a specific solution to the problem. And then in doing so, they're effectively setting a very often pretty tight specification about what the solution needs to look like, and then associated with that a certain budget to achieve it. Then you've got the delivery partners, which could be charity partners. They are really focused on delivering the specification within the budget, and they pay irrespective of what is achieved. And this is in contrast to where a payer is paying for outcomes. So in doing that, they're defining what success looks like, what are the outcomes that need to be achieved and that they would be willing to pay for. And then therefore, it allows flexibility for the delivery partners to constantly innovate and improve to really achieve those outcomes. And importantly, the donor or the agency only pays if the desired outcomes are achieved. So if done well, we think that outcomes-based contract can generate more alignment, more innovation, better outcomes, and ultimately better value for the payer as well. So you have, you know, outcome payers paying for social and environmental outcomes that are achieved by delivery partners, but there's a slight problem in the cash flow profile of a typical project. So here on the graph here, you'll see, of course, the yellow is the cost of delivering that the outcomes, and then the payments only come, you know, from, in this example, in year 3. So what you have here is a working capital gap that exists because the income comes later and you need to be investing ahead of time. And so to solve this, to unlock this mechanism, you are needing to have investors who are able to provide that working capital, but also crucially, we know that we need to also provide a lot of know-how so that both the outcomes payers and the delivery partners can successfully structure these outcomes-based contracts. And this is very much the role that Bridges has played in the UK market. So I think time is running short, but just quickly to say that globally, there have been about 220 of these contracts done. About 90 of them have been done in the UK, so clearly very much a leader globally. And then Bridges, we have been backing about 2/3 of those. So we've done now over 60 of these contracts. And we have found that they are able to leverage the spending really well. So every pound of spendings that government has made to pay for these outcomes, they've been able to generate a 10-fold multiplier effect in terms of the total public value that are also being generated alongside these outcomes contracts. And then finally, maybe later on we can touch on this in more detail. But here you have a view of the different sectors that we've gone into. Working with children and looking after family welfare, educational outcomes for these young people, and then with adults working to improve their employment potential through training, but also looking at the health outcomes and how you can help people manage chronic conditions better and therefore relieving the pressure on the health service. And then finally, tackling homelessness as well. So, this is a bit of an example of how we have found that the outcomes-based contract structure has been able to deliver these really strong outcomes as well as public value. And the final word to say is that we've been very happy with the way the market in the UK has developed. And then now we have looking to take this approach to other markets as well, including in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So I'll pause here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Low. Let's give her a round of applause. Yeah. You notice that when Alex designed this panel, he actually has the first presentation on some of the strategy business model innovation. Then we look into financial innovation. Now that we come down to Mr. Jonathan Wong's presentation to talk about some technological innovation. So Mr. Jonathan Wong, are you ready? By the way, you notice that we actually, do you want to play the video first or you want to have Mr. Jonathan Wong coming in first? Yep, oh here, okay. So let's have Mr. Jonathan Wong to join us. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you all so much for inviting me to speak at this event. Yeah, the previous two speakers were rather more inspiring than what I'm going to say right now, because I'm really going to talk about government policy, but I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. So my name is Jonathan Wong. I'm the Chief of Technology Innovation at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And I'm going to talk about kind of government policies to unlock business innovation for SDGs. And I will explain more around how we think about business innovation shortly. But for those of you, so bear with me, let me try and move slides. Okay, for those of you who don't know about United Nations ESCAP, we're the Asia Pacific arm of the United Nations. I'm based not too far away from you, further from Maggie, in Bangkok, in Thailand. And we really act kind of like a policy think tank. Much of my time is spent advising governments on policy, so I will focus on that. As I always say, companies have shareholders. I in the UN have governments, so really I work for the governments and I advise them on policy, and we act as a platform for kind of exchange of best practices and knowledge and all that sort of lovely stuff as well. On our agendas, I'll focus on a second one really, which a core part of our work is around policy frameworks for business innovation for the SDGs. And when we think about business innovation, we talk about these shifts that are needed if we are to kind of, again, achieve the ambitions of the SDGs and indeed deliver inclusive and sustainable development. So we talk about these shifts from entrepreneurship to social entrepreneurship, business as usual to inclusive business, and investing for profit to investing for impact. So this is kind of broadly what we mean and I mean when I speak about business innovation. Now for today, I just want to provide some kind of context. We'll all be very familiar with this. So some policy approaches that we've seen governments taking to promote business innovation for inclusive and sustainable development, and then just really finish on some key messages. So firstly, I mean, as we all know, I mean, business has been a real source of innovation and economic dynamism, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. You know, it's lifted millions out of poverty, but it's not always been good news, right? This has often been to the detriment of society and environment. We've seen CO2 emissions increase in step with the industrial revolutions. We've seen income inequalities growing now more than they've ever been before. And what for me as well is the pandemic has really shined a light on this even more. And the pandemic really turned into a story of the haves and the have-nots. I mean, you just watch the news. You know, we saw tech corporations' share prices soaring during the pandemic, while the very, very poorest people were barely able to make a living. And for me, that really revealed a kind of a fractured economy in dire need of innovation, quite frankly. And in this context, I mean, a lot of the work we do is really to support governments to put in place an enabling environment to get businesses and investors, or incentivize businesses and investors to put purpose alongside profit. So let me just kind of show you some examples and a framework of how we go about this work and the kind of work we've supported with governments to really support this inclusive and sustainable post-pandemic economic framework that many of us talk about and many of us hope for. So a lot of our work focuses predominantly on supporting governments to put in place policies and initiatives to promote social enterprise, inclusive business, and impact investing. And to give a few examples, I mean, we worked in Thailand and Republic of Korea on their social enterprise acts, which again gives special legal recognition of social enterprise and distinct recognition from a mainstream traditional business, and provides them with special kind of, if you like, special treatments and benefits through these acts. We've also seen kind of the growth of inclusive business. Now, I know most of you on this call will know social entrepreneurship, impact investing, but inclusive business in ASEAN is really gaining prominence. Now an inclusive business is a business that provides products and services to the very poorest people, and also provides them with livelihood opportunities. And as I mentioned during the pandemic, with the very poorest not being able to get the vaccines that we all get, not having access to the digital world and not being able to make a livelihood, you can see why kind of this idea is gaining traction in the economic development community. And in Cambodia, we recently worked with the government on their strategy for promoting inclusive business in Cambodia, what they call the IB strategy. And similarly in Vietnam, we worked with the government on their program to support private enterprises. Now, it may just be 2 words, but it took a long time to get the sustainable business into that strategy and program. And that's the kind of work we do. We work with governments not just to put strategies to promote enterprise, economic opportunity, but also integrate those social and environmental dimensions as well. And now, of course, all social enterprises, inclusive businesses, B Corps, however we call them, need access to finance. And to that end as well, we've worked on similar things like in Bangladesh with the Ministry of Finance on developing their impact investing strategy and action plan. And a very interesting piece of work in Bhutan, we worked with them on their foreign direct investment strategy to attract foreign investors to see Bhutan as a good place to develop their green technologies. And yeah, it was a really interesting piece of work. And really we worked with government to try and give investors come in and that assurance and maybe visibility of pipeline and deal flow that the government are also backing. And we talked about public-private partnership to kind of drive more investment into the clean tech sector. So we think about the role of government in 3 ways in promoting kind of, if you like, social entrepreneurship, inclusive business, and impact investing. One as a market facilitator, one as a market regulator, and finally as a market participant. And in terms of market facilitators, as mentioned, governments can put in place kind of an ambitious, forward-looking strategy around how they see business, as I mentioned, putting purpose alongside profit. And I mentioned in Cambodia that the inclusive business strategy which is a standalone strategy. But we've often seen different approaches taken. So, for example, in Indonesia, we worked with the government not to have a separate social enterprise strategy, but actually integrate social entrepreneurship within the fabric of their national development plan. We've also seen dedicated central units being developed to actually guide and shape the ecosystem in a country. So many of you will know the Korea Social Enterprise Promotion Agency, again, which is a dedicated public agency, while Singapore has taken a different track and a different approach with RAISE to promote social enterprise, which is actually a limited company, albeit backed by government and working closely in collaboration with government. The second role governments take is as a market regulator. And again, Vietnam was one of the first countries in the world, and indeed Southeast Asia or the world, to actually legally recognize social enterprise as a distinct legal entity. And Cambodia are doing something the same with inclusive business. And as a regulator as well, you can provide fiscal incentives. So we worked with the Thailand government on a royal decree to reduce the tax burden for impact investors, or indeed provide tax breaks to social enterprises. So if you're an impact investor or an investor, I know in Thailand, and you have the option of, I don't know, investing in a hotel in downtown Bangkok, or indeed a social enterprise that is providing low-cost housing solutions to the very poorest people in urban slums. And if you were to make that investment, you would get 100% tax break, which is what you would get. Would that help change decisions and investor mindsets? Finally, as a market participant, governments can actually provide their own funds. And we've seen this in India, where they have a social venture fund backed by the government. And indeed in Korea, they have a Korea Inclusive Finance Agency that provides credit guarantees to social enterprises. Do you know what? Sometimes investors see investments in social enterprises as more risky than investments in kind of pure for-profit enterprises, shall we say. And this guarantee scheme kind of maybe takes away some of that risk. That risk that investors may feel by providing the guarantee. And in terms of impact procurement as well, we've seen this kind of around the world as well, but the Seoul municipal government was one of the first countries or municipalities to do this, which gives preferential treatment in procurement to social enterprises. Just to mention, that was on a national level. At a regional level, as I mentioned, this agenda is gathering momentum, particularly on inclusive business. And just recently, we hosted the Inclusive Business Summit in ASEAN, and the economic ministers of all 10 ASEAN countries signed up to the Inclusive Business Guidelines. And we've been very actively working with the economic ministers of ASEAN to kind of now implement them to create this different type of business that we're all striving and hoping for. I just want to mention women and gender. I mean, the title of this session is Unlocking Resources for Sustainability. Now, it's fair to say we all know women first face far more challenges than men in starting their businesses, gaining access to finance. And really, in Asia-Pacific region, advancing women's equality could add as much as 4.5 trillion or 12% of GDP to the region's GDP by 2025. And with the economic slump that many countries are facing, just ignoring women entrepreneurs and enterprises is a dividend that few countries can ignore. And to that end, we've been doing a lot of work in encouraging countries to really focus more and put specific initiatives in place to promote women entrepreneurs. In Vietnam, we worked with them on a new Decree 80 for enhanced support for women entrepreneurs. And in Bangladesh, we've actually worked with them on the integration of gender perspectives into the Bangladesh Startup Framework. Now, Bangladesh government and the Prime Minister has a startup fund for Bangladesh, which invests in startups. And we worked with their team to actually put a gender lens in how they make investment decisions, but also how they measure the impact of their investments going forward as well. So just to end on key messages, I think what we've seen in this region, in terms of government policy on social enterprise, inclusive business and impact investing, the governments have really experimented and shown some leadership. I'm of the opinion that government policy making on these agendas are very much in their infancy. You know, with traditional economic policy, we know what our tools are. You can play with the interest rates, the tax system. You know, you can play with how much you spend on public services. You know what your metrics are, GDP, for better or worse. You know, inflation, unemployment. But actually, do we know what our metrics are for an impact economy? And I think that's a very different question. And do we know what the toolbox looks like in terms of government policy of what countries should do, depending on a level of development, context, and indeed culture as well. Again, I mentioned that policy making on this agenda is in its infancy. So with this in mind, I think the evaluation of many of the policies that I shared with you just now, together with continued innovative policy experimentation, will be critical to establish what works, and equally important what doesn't in different contexts. And of course, regional cooperation, including the sharing of knowledge, kind of effective practices, and lessons learned will be critical to scale up business innovation for inclusive and sustainable development, which is where kind of ESCAP comes in with our membership of 62 countries, all doing really cool and interesting things around government policy to promote social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And we act as that platform where they can share, learn from each other, and if you like, take this movement from the margins to the mainstream. I will stop there and pray that I was within time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And so I would like to encourage the audience here in person as well as online. If you have some questions, please write it down and then we'll come to you for some questions. But before we do that, I'm going to actually ask a few questions for our panelists. But I would like to go back to Jonathan first. Jonathan, being the Chief of Technology and Innovation, he actually is more policy driven than I am in the Department of Public Policy. And so I'm so excited that Alex really put together a cross-sectoral talent team here. And so, Jonathan, I would like to go back to the technology piece. What do you think about the technological innovation, digital transformation for the past 2 years, given the pandemic, and how do you see the future? And to what extent that may help SDG in the future, in the post-pandemic world?
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the kind of defining features of the pandemic has been the digital transformation that has permeated all of our lives. And I'll be honest with you, as a Chief of Technology Innovation for the Asia-Pacific region, the pandemic kind of did my job for me, right? I was asking governments to go digital and they kind of had to do it. So yeah, in that respect, and that's probably the only respect, I was very thankful for the pandemic. And indeed, during the pandemic, as we all know, it's been a lifeline for us, right? You know, we've been able to continue to work on Zoom. You know, our kids can still go to school, but through e-learning. We could still see a doctor through e-health platforms. But a really, and actually businesses, and I know this session has kind of a private sector angle. Businesses that had access to e-commerce and digital finance fared much better than those businesses that have not. I live in Bangkok, and I looked at the poor street food vendors, you know, who don't have access to digital finance, don't know what e-commerce is, and their lives were destroyed during the pandemic. But a really striking statistic around what you see, what the challenges could be in the future, is in the Asia-Pacific region, over 2 billion people do not have access to the digital world. 2 billion, that's half the population of Asia and the Pacific. So I think the biggest challenge really is from a government policy perspective, how we put inclusion at the heart of digital strategies. And I've just come out of supporting the government of Indonesia on their G20 presidency. And it was really encouraging to see the G20 committing to actually, what was the wording? Improving meaningful participation of vulnerable groups in the digital economy. And they targeted five groups: elderly people, women, people with disabilities, MSMEs, and rural communities. And I think if we are to have an inclusive digital future, we need to get very specific on what we mean by inclusion and have very targeted policies around, for example, those 5 groups. Because an inclusive digital policy for an elderly person will look very different from people with disabilities. You know what I mean? So I think we need to get more specific and not lose sight of the word inclusion, because we say it so much now, it's often meaningless. It's like sustainability. What we preach to governments is to get very specific on that, get very ambitious on that, measure that, and hopefully we can move forward with this inclusive digital economy. But yeah, that would be the key challenge from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That is actually a good tie to my question for Maggie, because Jonathan talked about the importance of measurement. Clearly, Maggie, in your very innovative way to think about investing, you actually care a lot about outcomes, and you deliver outcomes also, at the same time doing good business model. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about your impact investing or outcome-based investment approach? What kind of system is needed to support this kind of sustainability-oriented investment, and also any regulatory financial infrastructure issues? And what's your advice for Hong Kong or Asia, given your experiences in UK and other places?
Sure, thank you. I'll try my best and more to make an observation from the markets we have experience in. So I think these challenges that we've been talking about, the climate crisis, escalating inequalities, the recognition of these challenges is really creating strong tailwinds for business and private capital to respond. And I guess it's been great to see a whole generation now of businesses and social enterprise leaders who want to help tackle these challenges, with the good news that we are increasingly seeing a good track record of the ability to not only drive those positive outcomes, but also to do so, in creating some sort of financial returns, which obviously would be necessary for investors to be involved. In the UK and Europe, we've specifically, I suppose, seen a very much a sea change in entrepreneurs who are now more mission-oriented and want to use business as a force for good. We are increasingly finding investment opportunities that have a strong impact lockstep. By that, I mean the positive impact a business is having is also the very driver of commercial value. So the World of Books circular economy business that I mentioned before would be a prime example. Every book that they were able to resell is the book that is the most impactful because it's getting reused, but is also the book that is the most profitable for the business. So this lockstep between impact and commercial is really critical in channeling more capitals to these businesses. I think in this regard, particularly around the climate topic, I think what the UK government has done right is to be now been very consistent in its net zero carbon target and ambitions. And I think this sort of policy framework or the stability is really critical to provide that long-term signal so that investment could be comfortable really from investors' perspective to flow in that direction. And it's something that I think it could be a really powerful tool that government can be using to provide that stability in the market so that businesses can be reacting to finding solutions to the challenge that government has identified as a top priority. And more recently, I think another helpful driver is more and more private capital being more explicit in this drive towards both returns, but also driven by impact as well. So this comes in different flavors. You have asset owners who are dedicating a certain portion of their assets to driving sustainability and impact, to sustainability and impact being integrated all across an asset owner's entire portfolio. What is clear that is the growth in the global impact investment sector is growing very, very strongly, and is estimated to have exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in 2022 by the Global Impact Investing Network. I guess finally, just to conclude my response here, I talked a lot about outcomes-based contracts earlier. We really believe that these contracts, if done well, have a real tremendous potential to transform how public services are delivered, and in doing so, at the same time, driving down the cost and also improving the outcomes for people and planet. So clearly, in this particular regard, one of the first steps that government can be doing is changing the mix of how they commission commission contracts to be more based on the achievement of outcomes rather than activities. And in this way, I think a number of Asian countries have already had some early experience, including in Hong Kong and in Japan, that I'm aware of. And finally, another key ingredient which is tied to this technology point is data. Outcomes-based contracts are fundamentally reliant on the ability to measure outcomes, because that's how payments are then actually structured and paid out. So setting the right outcome metrics is critical, and so is getting reliable data throughout the life of project. And we have found that the flexibility to tweak service delivery is one of the advantages of outcomes-based contracts, and being able to have data early on in the life of a project to help course correct or make changes to the delivery program is also a key success factor. So I'll pause then, happy to discuss further. Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. Very insightful comments for us. Because of time, I'm going to actually ask just a brief question for Chen Yao and see whether you could share with us. You have provide a very innovative collaborative model for us. What's the secret sauce? How could we repeat that? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, we took the opportunity of a scheme by the government, the FIT scheme. We are committed. We don't believe that the analysis that Hong Kong lacks resources and space for renewable energy. We are ready to combine different elements and think out of the box. So NGO usually get funding for a one-off course, and all funders said, we cannot give you recurrent funding. So how do you cope with that? You know, so we take climate change as a crisis. I guess all these different elements, somehow, if we keep working on them, we'll find a innovative combination of the unusual partners in terms of not just organization, also ideas and policies. So I hope people keep thinking about new things and don't just think that if you go back to the office and do the things that you did yesterday and do it well, and then the world will change. So it's change starts with being able to take risk and trying out new things and be ready for success and also for sometimes failure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your advice. So let's open up to the floor to have some questions. If you have any questions, yes, please. And by the way, those who are online, if you have some questions, I guess you could type it in the chat, and then we could see that here also.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My question is to Jonathan and Maggie directly. It's really great to see the movement that's been happening, but more specifically, I think SMEs are being left out of this conversation around addressing a lot of these issues and the impacts that they could have. And both of your presentations sort of dovetailed around the issue of what we could broadly call blended finance. And so I'm curious about what your views are on the potential of blended finance to have an impact, what the roadblocks would be to actually getting that finance into the hands of SMEs, and whether that could actually have an impact towards addressing these two big crises that we face around climate and sustainable development. Thank you.
So let's do it this way. Let's collect several questions first, and then we'll ask the speakers to respond to them. Any other questions, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I have two questions for Maggie. And so social impact bond has been around for a few years. And I know in UK, it's been developing really well. And I wonder, what's the major challenge actually facing the development of a contract? Because I understand that in Hong Kong, somehow, the difficulty has always been around, the negotiation of the return rate between the funder and the pay for success, right? So all the funder and the investors would require certain level of return rate. So would you mind discussing this and enlighten us a little bit? And the second question is, among your portfolio, right? So you could either invest directly into social enterprises or green businesses, and then you could also say go for social impact bond. And so these basically two approaches. And then do you, when you make decisions, so what drive you to go for social impact bond, and what drive you to go for impact investing? Thank you.
All right. Let's take one more question if there's any. Yep.
Hello. I'm Jack from APRU, and just want to say hi to Jonathan because we worked on the AI for Social Good project with Google. I just wonder if there's something that universities across Pacific Rim region and the globe can do in terms of some of the issues you mentioned about the definition of diversity and inclusion or measurement of impact in terms of sustainability, because I think previous session, there was a question about greenwashing, for example. So how do we tackle that, and what the universities have a role in that? Thank you.
And Chanya also has a question for Maggie.
I'm Nora from Impact Analytics. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself.
Okay, it's following Laura's question. A lot of investors I go to meet, and they say social impact is good, but I want the financial impact to be guaranteed first. And among all the financial impact, if they achieve the same level of return, then I will select those with a sustainability and ESG goal. So can you say something to the investors that this is the old mentality they need to get rid of, and do you face these kind of investors in your UK context? Thank you.
All right, so let's have Maggie to respond to a number of questions about financing mechanism and negotiation, and then go to Jonathan.
Yeah, sounds good. And Jonathan, maybe I'll leave that first one to you. I'll is that okay, Jonathan? Thanks. I'll go in the order actually that the questions came in, and thank you so much for the interest to learn more. So the question about the challenge of developing these outcomes-based contracts, and you mentioned, I think, touching on this idea of the returns being one of the roadblocks that you're experiencing in Hong Kong. For us in the UK, actually now the major challenges is not actually raising the capital, the investors part of that equation. For us is about encouraging enough of these contracts to be structured in this way. And therefore, the heart of it is about that commissioning part that I mentioned, is encouraging commissioners. They could be a local government, central government, could be our National Health Service, for example, to do a change. So ultimately, it's about changing from the status quo, whereby traditionally they might be thinking about, okay, let's take the issue of homelessness. They might be thinking, well, I'm going to commission for a particular charity, potentially, to go out and work with a certain number of homeless individuals, without actually specifying what are the outcomes that they want to be achieving. Because simply going out and talking to these homeless individuals, you might not actually be tackling the underlying roots of the issues that have caused them to be rough sleeping or not be able to get into employment. But if you are trying to actually solve that homelessness in the first place, you're actually hopefully touching on, for a particular individual, they might have health issues that have caused them to not be able to be in work, and therefore they have not been able to afford to rent. And then that's how they ended up on the street. For others, it could be a returning veteran, and just not having that community connections anymore, and therefore they just find it hard to get started again. So really focusing on the outcomes means that you are tailoring the solution for the individual rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach. Now this change requires a change in the mindset of the commissioners, and sometimes the benefit that they're generating is actually felt by other parts of the economy and other parts of the government budget. And so it's been really important in the UK context to create a pot of outcomes payments that is able to supplement local government budget, so that the commissioners is able to commission based on outcomes. So that's something that we have seen to be the challenge. The returns part, we have historically now found that we've been able to return on average probably high single-digit IRR to low double-digit IRR. This is on a contract basis, and on a net basis, we are definitely then looking at a more modest return, so probably, mid-single digit net IRR returns for our investors. And that has been acceptable to a community of investors who are very mission oriented. We view, and they also view this as still, if strictly not fully market rate returns for the risk that they're taking, because ultimately, whilst we have this term called social impact bond, it's not a fixed income instrument. It is equity risk that they're taking, only that the risk is tied more to the outcomes being delivered rather than, often not yet as correlated to the market, public market, for example. And so we actually have, we have been very careful to not raise too much money actually from our investors, because we know the amount of work that is needed to work with government bodies to structure these contracts to be commissioned this way. So, on that point about the how we make decisions around how do we use private capital to achieve the outcomes, our approach is to be very specific. So we raise our capital into specific strategies. So I talked about our 3 verticals in backing businesses, real estate, and then the social outcomes contracts. We don't raise one main pot of capital and then look to deploy into a specific way to use the money. We have raised specific pots of capital that's only focused on backing businesses, that's only looking to drive and make real estate investments, and then a specific fund for the social outcomes contracts work. In this way, we're better able to match the expectations and the targets that a particular investor has from a financial returns and also outcomes and impact perspective. And so therefore, at the moment, our social outcomes contracts funds, if you will, are a relatively small part of the 1.4 billion that I mentioned we've raised. It's about 10% of that. The other remaining 90% are split somewhat evenly between the growth business funds and the real estate funds, which have different financial returns targets. And so this is how we differentiate. And so whenever we come across an investment opportunity, we're already immediately thinking, okay, which is the right pot of capital to be backing that opportunity. And then in terms of the mentality of impact versus financial returns, I think I've kind of answered it a bit in the way that we raise the capital. You definitely have a much bigger pool of capital who are able to say, what you were saying, that they want the cake and eat it too. They want the financial returns, and then the impact is kind of a nice to have. But increasingly, we're seeing both institutions as well as family office who are saying, look, we need to make a bit of more of a change, and we need to be more catalytic. And so we're going to be saying, look, we want to buy more outcomes, and then we will have a different tolerance, if you will, on the financial return side. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Maggie. A lot of innovative new thinking about investment. Jonathan, what do you think about the SME roles and also university roles?
Yeah, sure. Just the point on blended finance first, because I think that was raised as well. In theory, it's amazing, right? We align different forms of capital towards a common objective, that the world will be an amazing place and all our problems be solved. But as you rightly said, that there are challenges. I think the first thing is around blended finance. If you're blending different types of capital from different types of organizations, collaboration is difficult, right? Even between two parties. Now, if you're blending finance from different parties, of course it's going to get more complicated, and that's a challenge. Of course, as well, the moment you bring money into any conversation, of course it gets even more complicated from there. I think certainly there's something around, I'm probably not the right word, kind of egos or agency. Everybody wants their capital to be catalytic. They don't like to be catalyzed. Everyone likes to leverage someone else's capital. Not everyone likes to be leveraged. I think there's a bit of that as well. But I think the most important thing really is just for blended finance to work is to have that common objective. Now, you may have private investors, governments, philanthropists coming together in a blended finance instrument where they all say, yeah, we all agree solving climate change is our biggest priority. If you dig deeper into some of their objectives, they'll be very, very different. And I think that alignment of objective is the key to making kind of blended finance work, because sometimes parties may think they speak the same language. We've all been in these meetings, right? When we walk out, we realize we weren't at all. On SMEs being left out, I quite agree. And my whole career I've focused on, I'm not a social entrepreneur, but I've always focused on how I can support social entrepreneurs and impact entrepreneurs, however we call them. And that led me to working in impact investing and now in government policy to support them. But you're right, SMEs are getting left behind. In that conversation, not all MSMEs can be social enterprises, right? Or inclusive business that I spoke about. I mean, again, at a street level, I look at the street vendor. I look at the person who fixes my shoes in his shop. These aren't social entrepreneurs. They're just trying to make a living. And in that respect, a lot of our work now has been focused more on how we can better bring SMEs on that journey with us. And to give an example, in Cambodia, we invested in a startup called She Investments that provides a big problem in Cambodia is that MSMEs, particularly women-led, don't have the financial records or digital skills to actually produce financial records, get loans from banks. So we worked on this very simple app that allowed women to kind of track what money was coming in, what they were spending, and it generated those financial records to make them more kind of, if you like, part of the formal economy in many ways. And indeed, we're working, not every enterprise is going to be a unicorn, right? And we also worked in Cambodia on a credit guarantee fund from like $10,000 to $40,000 for SMEs, especially those who were seen as riskier investments or riskier in the terms of banks. So most of the very poorest people with no collateral and women as well. So we're looking at that more micro level. But going forward, I think you're quite right. A big focus of our work going forward will be around how we can bring MSMEs into the digital economy for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, around businesses faring better who've been on e-commerce and having access to digital finance, and actually thinking about how we can promote the green transition of business as well, and what governments can do to actually, for businesses to support that transition to the green economy, and new business that are starting up, what incentives and what sorts of instruments can they put in place to encourage that as well? So no, in short, I quite agree with you, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. Just on Jack's question about the role of universities, as mentioned through our work together on AI, we were having to go in and we were asked questions from governments around what does an AI governance framework look like? And I was like, I don't know, because it's new and no one's really had one. And I think there's a role of universities in there around providing that academic rigor, particularly around policy making. And as I mentioned as well, on this whole impact economy agenda, kind of social enterprise impact investing agenda, as I mentioned, in terms of government policy making, it's still in its infancy, really. And I think tracking, a lot of evaluation around the impacts of social impact bonds has been done, and Maggie will know about them. But things like, I don't know, should you formally recognize a social enterprise or not? These sorts of questions, kind of, do we know if that's worked or hasn't? I think we need academia to provide the academic rigor on what is still a very early stage policymaking agenda so that we can move forward. And selfishly for me, when I'm advising governments on these agendas, I can do it from a baseline of kind of academic rigor and evidence as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Some challenges for us in the academic world. At this point, I want to make sure that we actually practice what we preach, since we talk about impact investment and impact assessment, right? So I think there's a QR code that we need to show for our audience to actually scan to give us some feedback of this panel. So if you could project that. While we are doing that, I want to actually ask a final question for the speakers to wrap up today's session. So for those who are in the audience, please scan the QR online. You see the QR code, please scan that. But I would like to go back to Chan Yao and also to wrap up the whole panel on one question actually from our online audience. To wrap up, we talk about public-private partnership. We talk about all kinds of cross-sectoral partnership. What would be the key criteria to identify the right partners in your projects?
I think number one is mission, same mission. That's the most important. Number two is innovation, ready to work with new partners on new things. And number three is perseverance, being able to walk a little bit longer than usually people anticipate.
Maggie, what do you think?
I think overall is that alignment of the goals that the partners have, and this is both financially and from an impact perspective, because all of that, as we were talking about, that stems, that is the root of the way that you will be setting up the approach, how you will be evaluating it and managing it going forward. In the case of the social outcomes contracts, there are 3 key ingredients that we have found to be really important. One is flexibility, to be able to make changes along the way in order to achieve those outcomes that are being shared. And the nice thing about the social outcomes contract is that you can drive a lot of accountability as well, because you are setting up that goal up front and then uniting all efforts to really achieve those same outcomes, because they're also going to drive the financial returns. And finally, collaboration is going to be key, because we have found that there's not been one contract or one project we've done where we have been able to just put the money in and then just it is going to manage itself. It's needed a lot of active project management and collaboration across all the parties, including with the payers, right? And so this sort of really active dialogue and collaboration is really critical.
Jonathan?
Yeah, just to agree with what's been said, yeah, alignment of mission and goals, but with the caveat that, as I mentioned earlier, being very specific on what the measures of success are for all the parties, because we all may have the same mission, but we're all going to have a different perspective of what success looks like. That would be the only thing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's give the panelists a round of applause. And Alex, we are sorry that you are not here, but I hope that we have fulfilled the job that you indeed hopefully feel that we have find the right partners for this panel, and we do indeed talk a lot about different solutions. So I hope that there is some good food for thoughts for all of us to think about and move forward. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Jonathan.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.